Mike Lynch, the BBC software, I beg your pardon, the British software tycoon behind Autonomy, will wake up in detention in California today. He's facing 17 charges related to the sale of the company to Hewlett-Packard in 2001. He's been fighting extradition to the United States since 2019, and in December he told us what he thinks is wrong with the current extradition agreement with the US.
If the US requests an extradition of any British citizen in the UK, they don't need to have had any connection with America. They are basically default extradited. And that's a situation where they're taken from their homes, moved over to the US. They may be in the US for 2 or 3 years before a trial even happens, if it even does. Some of that time they may even be in jail. And the treaty that we have with the US means that there is no protection for that citizen. It's almost impossible for a judge or the Home Secretary to stop that happening.
Mr. Lynch got on a plane to California on Thursday. A judge in the United States ruled that he posed a serious flight risk and set bail at £80 million. We're joined now by the Conservative MP and long-standing campaigner on individual rights, David Davis. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Your reaction to this development in what is quite a long-running story?
Well, it's an almost inevitable outcome of a dreadful extradition treaty. I mean, in essence, the treaty says that if, let's say, the Americans claim somebody from Britain for extradition, the Secretary of State must dispatch them, whereas if we claim somebody the other way around, the Secretary of State may dispatch them. And so we've sent 230 odd, I think, people to the US, and they've sent 80 to us, only 11 of them are their own citizens, mostly they're foreigners. It was a thing that was put in place after 9/11, supposedly for terrorism, murder, and paedophilia. Those are the 3 things that were pitched to the House of Commons when it was presented. 2/3 of the people we've extradited have been for non-violent, mostly white-collar crimes.
And how's that happened? I'm sorry, forgive me for interrupting, but how has the way it was sold turned out to be so far from what's actually occurred?
Well, I think in part because of the aggressive. I mean, part of it's the law was written badly. I mean, the Americans have constitutional protections we don't have. Indeed, I mean, if you're a German or a Frenchman, you couldn't be extradited to the US at all. For reasons I'll come on to in a second. So it's partly that, but partly it's a very, very aggressive approach to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is essentially a very political and commercial organization. I mean, the district attorneys in most states are elected, so they're politicians. The Department of Justice generally has a sort of revolving door between itself and particularly the Silicon Valley companies. I think 360 exchanges in, of course, the last decade, and also the Wall Street companies. So it gets, and it's very aggressive about exercising its power. This was a deal, a sale on the London Stock Exchange of a British company by Hewlett-Packard, who bid 66% over the market rate. I mean, mostly you don't go above 30%. And done by a Dutch company set up for them. It had no American interest whatsoever, except that they claim American shareholders are harmed by it. So it's an aggressive stance by the DOJ that is one of the big problems.
You make the point that this was a deal done on the London Stock Exchange. What sort of impact is this law having on people who are doing the kind of business that Mr. Lynch was?
Well, it will be devastating because it will have a hideously chilling effect. I mean, if you were a young software writer or a biochemist with a new drug or a new treatment or whatever, and you built a company out of it, the last place now you're going to launch your company is on the London Stock Exchange. Because if an American buyer comes along, and that's the most likely buyer in a high-tech company, if an American buyer comes along and buys it, you are liable for the next 10 years suddenly to find yourself facing possible extradition and facing trial in America because they don't like the deal. They've got buyer's remorse. That's exactly what happened with Hewlett-Packard. And bear in mind, if you do get extradited, you won't be able to bring any defense witnesses because they'll be subject to threat of prosecution too. That's what's happened with Mr. Lynch.
So again, sorry to interrupt, but if things really are as bad as you say they are, we are talking about a country that's supposed to be one of our closest allies. Why is it that the Conservative government, which has been in power all these years, hasn't managed to change this, to do a better deal?
Well, the trouble, I mean, two things really. One is frankly, the uselessness of the Home Office. I mean, its officials. I'm being
That's
blunt
quite
as
clear.
I can here.
Yep.
Yeah. Its officials really don't take this seriously. Partly because it's an issue which is very rarely in the public domain, because it's a single individual. There was a gentleman a few years ago. There was the NatWest 3. They're sort of spread out. There's no big deal here. It only becomes apparent when they have done very silly things, like they attempted to extradite an autistic teenager, Gary McKinnon, at one point, and we stopped that one. And they refused to send back Anne Secoulas after she led to the death of Harry Dunn. So it only very rarely comes to the top of the tree, and it's only people like me who go on about it ad nauseam.
Well, I'm sure we will come back to it, but we must leave it there for the moment. David, thanks very much indeed for joining us.